do you like the feeling of power you have as a newspaper proprietor, of being able to sort of formulate policies for a large number of newspapers in every state of Australia?
Well, there's only one honest answer to that, of course, and that's yes. Of course one enjoys the feeling of power. The newspaper can create great controversies, stir up arguments within the community, discussion. It can throw light on injustices, just as it can do the opposite. It can hide things and be a great power for evil. It's not a perfect system, obviously, but can you think of a better one?
Hello and welcome to the 11th episode of Murdocracy, a podcast that keeps an eye on the news and influence of News Corp, the most influential media company in the Western world. I'm Cam Wilson.
And I'm Natalie Sekulovska.
Natalie, this isn't Sammy. What are you doing here?
Well, I hope you enjoy, having me on the 11th podcast. I'm very excited to be here today. So
good to have you. Yeah. So Sammy is out this week because he's having surgeries on his eyes. I say surgeries because I think he's having different surgeries on each of his lenses, which is going to mean that I think he can actually ditch the glasses. Not that you've probably seen him potentially, but I think he's very excited about that. But because of that, he's out. Natalie is our producer. She's joined recently. I'm very excited to have her on here. And in a way, it's actually a bit of a reunion for us because we used to work together back on community radio, and look at us together. We're now on podcasts.
That's right. We're heading into the future. We're in the podcasting sphere now. It's really, really exciting to be in this space because when we were on community radio, we were doing live radio, so it's completely different.
Nat, I've been watching what's been happening in Melbourne over the last week. There has been a lot of protests, ostensibly about Victoria's pandemic bill, but really about any real grievance from people who don't like vaccine mandates, who don't like mask mandates, who don't like vaccines or other things. Have you been watching it?
I have been watching them, and it's actually interesting because they've also been happening to a certain extent here in Sydney as well, just around, I think, the CBD and Newtown. So I have been keenly watching what's happening in Melbourne and Sydney. And I think it's interesting that you mentioned that it started off, obviously, about this bill and, pandemic freedoms. But I think at the same time, it's turned into a bit of a mishmash of issues, I think. I think at the end of the day, the people who are attending these protests, I don't think they even know what these protests are about anymore.
Yeah, they are a bit all over the place. I mean, I was watching the protests now yesterday, so that was Saturday, a week after the first big protest about this bill had kind of happened. And the bill, which is a pandemic bill, which is about slightly changing the laws, I think, so that the power to declare a pandemic isn't just with isn't with the chief health officer, but is with the state premier and also the health minister and a variety of other things. The bill was barely mentioned, which is kind of funny because, I mean, there are some people who have some legitimate opposition to the bill, but you've also got all these people out there who are really sick of having to be told what to do. And I do have an empathy for that because, we've been in lockdowns and that kind of thing for 18 months and we're kind of out of it now. But people are, they've felt their lives change a lot. They've been alienated, all that kind of stuff. But at the same time, we can understand it, but also say that what they're talking about and a lot of what they're, pushing against is ridiculous. These protests clearly have a real conspiracy bent to them. We've seen kind of extremist elements in them as well. It's a whole mishmash, and I think the truth is it's probably just gonna boil over and run out of steam because they're not really actually asking for anything, and so eventually they're just gonna get bored of it, I reckon.
That's right. And I think it's also interesting to also acknowledge that there's people from all walks of life. So you can't just say, it's people, from the right of politics or the left of politics or, people from certain ethnic backgrounds. Like, it was interesting. I saw photos on Twitter yesterday of these protests. I think they were from Melbourne, and they actually had flags, but not just not just any flags. It was flags of people from different kind of multicultural backgrounds. And I mean, I myself, I'm a Macedonian Australian, and seeing those flags out there, it's just so interesting to see that there are people in multicultural communities, for example, who have felt quite alienated, but also who have fallen into the trap of these conspiracy theories that have been running rampant on WhatsApp. And you've seen it with family members, you've seen it with friends. It's just interesting to see this mentality and just how it's spread like wildfire, I think,
Yeah.
especially during the pandemic.
Yeah, totally. And one thing I think I should mention, which is relevant to this podcast as well, is, I mean, we've seen violent imagery with the gallows at the last week's protest. We've seen, act of violence against an MP's daughter, which I think originally the Andy Medic, who is in a crossbench in the state parliament, he originally said it was because of his identity, because he's been working with the government and negotiating over the bill. And I think he walked it back and said that his daughter was just covering up anti-vax posters when she was attacked. But either way, we've seen this real, I've seen not just like extremists at these protests, but an escalation of kind of like violent imagery and rhetoric, and now even like this kind of stuff happening. And I think part of it has to come back to people who've called and spent a lot of time calling Victoria a dictatorship, the dictator Dan thing. Like, Michael Kroger, who's the former president of the Liberal Party, he was on Sky News this week saying, this bill is modern fascism. I mean, it's not. It's really not. Like, you don't have to be super well acquainted to know that it's not fascism. Yeah, there's people have said there's issues with it, legitimate issues with it. But like, I just kind of see, the way that, and this is particularly led by News Corp, the criticism and the intensity of rhetoric, calling these things like extreme power grabs, like all this stuff. I'm not going to say it's the only thing to blame for it, but it just raises the temperature. And I don't know, I get very like, I kind of get upset about it because I'm like, this is happening and it's only going to let people, make people think it's worse. And when people are backed into the corner, when they feel they are, they're going to act out.
It's this narrative, right, that I think News Corp has, been pushing, particularly during the pandemic, about, we need to protect our freedoms. And it's kind of, it has escalated, but I think it's also masked, the actual problems at play here. And to be honest, I think with, whether it's the bill in Victoria or also this week we saw there were also issues in New South Wales Cabinet as well with, do we extend the COVID emergency powers until 2023? So we are having a similar issue here in New South Wales. And I think this whole extremist approach to, we need to, take back our freedoms is actually masking a bigger issue at play, which is, well, do we actually, how much power do we actually give governments when it comes to, emergency powers like this during an emergency situation? Like, for example, how much scope do we give the New South Wales government to be able to curtail our freedoms? So I think it is obviously a very important conversation that we need to have about, what kind of emergency powers do we extend, which ones are important to extend, how much power do we give back to, our state governments when it comes to our freedoms. And I think this whole extremist approach is actually kind of taking away. It's a bit of a distraction, I think, from issues that are actually quite important that we need to be having, I think, quite realistic and reasonable, I think, level-headed conversations about.
Totally. Yeah, there's no space for just a kind of rational conversation. So
that's
yeah,
right.
it's concerning. But hey, I guess that's what we're here to break down and chat about. So before we get on to News Corp News of the Week, I just want to thank our new patrons, people who've signed up to support the show. Thank you to Avril and Fred. It means a lot. We do this just in our spare time, and people who are able to kind of contribute, kick a few dollars to us for hosting the show, for doing all the stuff behind the scenes, the cost that's behind it really helps. If you do want to support this, you like this, you can go to patreon.com/Murdocracy. That's patreon.com/Murdocracy, Murdocracy. why. Thanks to those and everyone else who supports us. It means a lot.
So at the company's annual shareholder meeting this week, News Corp's Rupert Murdoch hit out at a favourite target, Google and Facebook, of course. So Murdoch says for many years our company has been leading the global debate about big digital. Quote, what we have seen in the past few weeks about the practices at Facebook and Google surely reinforces the need for significant reform. So Murdoch also accused Facebook's employees of trying to silence conservative voices and noted a similar pattern of selectivity in Google's search results. Cam, what do you think? Is this true?
Oh, look, I don't know. The old argument about that conservatives are being silenced online by big tech is such a just like it's there's never any real proof that it's true. I mean, if you look at the top performing Facebook sites or Facebook pages on the platform, they're all like conservative media. If anything, it seems like progressive media. It probably have more of an argument to say they're being silenced, or at least, not succeeding in the same way. But certainly, I don't think that there's any platform discrimination against it. Look, I think the interesting thing is that, and we've said this before, News Corp really did actually lead the way in how news media companies have been able to deal with Facebook and Google. They said a decade ago, we're going to get them to pay for our content. Everyone at the time said that's crazy. And look at us now, the news media bargaining code. We've got Facebook and Google paying all this money to license things like News Corp content. So they really did kind of work out. I guess the kind of interesting thing that I find here is that even though I think News Corp has a really good position with tech companies at the moment, which is that, their content, they get paid to put their content on there, and they get preferential treatment because they're one of the preferred content providers, news services. So they get, their content gets to heaps of people as well. So they're getting money directly, and also they're getting the benefits of their content being shown to more people, which means more people paying for it, hopefully. The fact that they're still, I think, like turning the screws on it kind of shows that they're not letting up. They're not kicking their feet back and saying we're all good. They still want to, even though they've got themselves in a really good position, they still just want to make sure the pressure's on, because I think that they know that the reason that they've been able to get such good terms, is because they've been able to lead a critical campaign against these companies. And with reason, there's plenty of, I'm a tech reporter. I spend all my time saying about all the things that Facebook and Google are doing that, are problematic, and they're hugely rich and powerful companies. So I'm not feeling bad for them. But what News Corp has been able to do, particularly like News Corp, is be lead critical coverage, which has led, the Australian government to be well, we actually do need to do something about this imbalance. So they know that their power is through setting the agenda, through dictating, discourse in the public. And this shows is that even though they've got things going really well, they're just not going to let that up.
I think it's an interesting dynamic between, more traditional media like News Corp and, Google and Facebook. Like, for example, I think Rupert Murdoch obviously sees Google and Facebook and all of these, new tech, media spaces as competitors. But at the same time, you actually need to, they actually need to work together. Like News Corp actually needs Google and Facebook
totally
to have any kind of influence in this new age world. And that's where it's heading. The future isn't in print anymore. It's all online, and Google and Facebook are the way forward. And Rupert Murdoch knows this. So I think it's an interesting dynamic and relationship there, where obviously they're in competition with one another, but they also need to be cordial and work together, because they're not going to actually get anywhere.
Yeah, always give them a bit of a kick, but not too much.
Yeah, that's right. And so Murdoch has also called on Donald Trump to move beyond the past in the service of American conservatives. So this comes weeks after Trump had a letter to the editor in the Wall Street Journal repeating the false claim that the 2021 presidential election was rigged. Murdoch said the past is the past and the country is now in a contest to define the future. What do you think this means for Donald Trump?
Ooh, I don't know. I actually think it is kind of important. Now, people might remember that in the first place, News Corp in the US wasn't actually behind Donald Trump. They actually got behind him, I think, later into the campaign when I'm assuming that they saw that he had a bit of momentum, and also the way that the stuff that they did on him drew such a big audience. I think, this isn't a political podcast, particularly this is a US political podcast. I'm not an expert on it, but I do know that Trump remains he remains the front runner for their nomination for the next presidential election. But he really does still also have a bit of a hold over the party where people are kind of scared to speak out too much to disagree with him. We saw there was a governor's election in Virginia recently where the person who beat out the Democrat in a kind of like a not super conservative state was able to do it by kind of keeping Trump voters, in the House, but also he didn't super align himself with Trump. Like, Trump was, I think, suggested that he wanted to come and kind of campaign with him for the end. Towards the end of the campaign, and the candidate who ended up becoming governor was just kind of like, oh no, or he made sure that he was somewhere else at the exact same time. So I think that's kind of all to say that, like, we've seen this, we've seen this relationship between the Republicans and the conservative movement in the US and News Corp. It goes both ways. They kind of influence each other. One leads one at one time, the other one leads the other one at other times. This does seem like one of those opportunities where, Rupert Murdoch, without having to directly tell his editors to actually do something, can kind of just send out a message saying, you know what, I think we're over this guy. We need to, move on a bit. And I imagine that will be heard and affect coverage throughout the whole company.
Do you think that's actually going to happen with Donald Trump?
Yeah, I think it'll just be like, it won't be like super anti-Trump, but I just think it'll be like giving him less attention and focusing more on other people. Like, I don't think it's going to turn around and be like, oh, Trump is actually the enemy of the state, or like whatever, like super, have Tucker Carlson doing editorials against him. I think the way that they'll deal with it is that they're just going to give him less attention, because at the end of the day, like, Trump got so much attention during the 2016 election campaign because he had these rallies which people like to watch, and so they're on TV all the time, particularly on somewhere like Fox News. And he would tweet all the time, and then every time he tweeted, that would be covered, and then whoever responded to the tweet, that would be covered as well. And so that kept this constant attention on him. But he's not on social media anymore. And if he's not doing rallies at the moment, or if they're not being broadcast, his power kind of becomes muted. So my understanding is like, this is the power of News Corp. Not that they make up things, not that they are telling people what to say, but they decide what to pay attention to. And my gut feeling would be like, they'll just pay less attention to him, more attention to someone else who will end up probably being the nominee.
So, Media Week published a ranking of the top Australian news sites according to SimilarWeb. ABC was at the top with 113 million views in October 2021, but there were a few News Corp entries. News.com.au came in second with 96 million. Then there's no News Corp page until number 14, which is the Herald Sun at 9.4 million, before the Oz at 8.5 million. Notably absent, the Daily Telegraph, not seen in the top 20. Cam, what do you think of these rankings?
Well, I think it shows how important something like news.com.au is to the entire organization. I mean, look, the difference between news.com.au, which has 96 million views and doesn't have a paywall, of course, that kind of goes hand in hand, to the next News Corp publication, which had 9 million views, which was the Herald Sun. I mean, that's 10 times the amount of the next one. That's huge. And I guess it's also not a coincidence that, news.com.au also tends to not have some of that more like full on like culture war-y stuff that you see in places like The Australian. They are, they make an effort to be more progressive on things like climate change as well. So I guess, in a way, we can also see, what is really appealing, appealing to the broader like Australian public. It is kind of like, we've spoken in the past a bit about how News Corp is actually kind of successfully moving to getting paying subscribers, and then now I think officially getting more revenue directly from people who pay for their content than from advertisers. It does kind of show you that, like, the ABC still remains, I'm guessing, would be pretty close to bigger than all of these. No, just about all of those News Corp publications combined in the top 20. But also, like, things like the Guardian, has twice as many readers as the Herald Sun and that kind of stuff. Yeah, I don't know. I think sometimes we can overstate the kind of media monopoly in Australia, but in digital media, News Corp is far from the most dominant company, I think.
Yeah, that's actually interesting because, when we talk about, these culture wars or whatever, we normally think about News Corp, being quite influential and, being read by a lot of people. And obviously, 96 million views for news.com.au. And then even for the Herald Sun with 9.4, that's still a lot of readers. But um, but I think, just on news.com.au for a second their stories are quite clickbaity.
Oh yeah.
And, I think that's also very appealing for a lot of people. I think especially now with social media, on Twitter, for example, you've got your news feed and you're literally just scrolling through. And because of that, the tweet, letter limit or whatever it is, I think that's kind of changed the way that we consume or the way that we subconsciously want to consume media. And so I think it's just so much easier with news.com. You see kind of, this clickbaity headline in your face
Yeah.
and, you feel like you get the story, you click on it and you've got all these, photos and pictures. It's very, I think we're in an era now where we're consuming media quite differently. So I could be looking into this way too much, but I think
No.
that's also, I think that's definitely a factor in why it's come in second. And I think, with the ABC for a moment there, I'm actually not too surprised that it's at the top there because they were the ones, for the past 2 years during the pandemic, they were the ones who, had their press conferences, the Premier's press conferences playing every day. I think also before that we had the bushfires and then they were playing regular press conferences during the bushfires. And so I think at the end of the day, it's quite interesting that the ABC and news.com.au are up there because news.com.au paints a picture of everyone just wanting quick news instantly, whereas ABC up there also shows that people want, credible information right now, especially in emergency situations like the bushfires and COVID, which we've been living with for the past, I think it's been 2.5, 3 years now. So,
Yeah.
it's an interesting dichotomy seeing those two up there at the top.
Yeah, absolutely. Do you think that, so something I picked up on that, which is totally off topic, but we'll indulge ourselves. Do you think that we've had all these intense media events? We had the bushfires, had a bit of a break, then we had COVID, which is really, dragged on, I think we can all say. It's been a bit of a bummer. What do you think is going to happen? Do you think people are going to switch off? Like, I have this theory that everyone's about to switch off, like, in a big way over summer for, like, months because we're all just sick of the news.
I actually think we will switch off until the next big event. Like we did have
no.
bushfires, we had COVID. I'm anticipating that something else will happen. But no. Jokes aside, I do agree with you on that. I do think people will switch off, and I think people already have switched off. I think for the first maybe year and a half, yes, we were all watching the COVID press conferences, but I also know a lot of people who just switched off the press conferences completely. They didn't know what the COVID case numbers were. You and I, obviously working in media, we were constantly watching press conferences. We were following the protests. We were all on top of it. And I think there were days where we just wanted to switch off as well, but couldn't. So
Oh,
yeah. So I have a feeling, I think news is still important to some people at this stage, but I think in this kind of post bushfires, post COVID, post emergency kind of world that we're living in, I have a feeling that people will switch off. I think it might actually change the type of news that we potentially consume. I think there might be more of a taste for lighter news, more happier news. I think so. I think subconsciously, I think it will change the way that we consume news, and I think it might change the way uh, the way, or I guess the places that we go to consume news. But I think that's going to be a bit of a slow burn process, and I think it's going to be a subconscious thing. I don't think it's something that we're actually going to be aware of.
Yeah, look, no offense to Kerry Chan, but if I ever see her face again, it'll be too soon.
Yeah, I think she's completely done with, press conferences and, being in the media and anything to do with COVID. I think she probably wants a holiday too. Now, news is in the talks to buy Stockhead, an indie ASX shares website. According to Nine Papers' Zoe Samios, Stockhead describes itself as a team of highly experienced full-time reporters and contributors who produce independent journalism covering what we like to call the ASX 2000. News Corp formed a centralised business news desk, the Australian Business Network, which is run by The Australian, which is a sign of how they were putting more focus on business. What's the significance of this purchase, do you think?
I think this is just another example of how they need to try and expand what they're doing for their subscribers, because the difference between someone potentially who maybe picks up a paper every day or picks up when they choose to, or someone who subscribes, which is consistent, paying for something, means that they need to get ongoing kind of benefit out of it, which means that the more you can kind of do for someone, the more invaluable you make yourself, the better. And that's different to something like news.com.au, which is just like we're just trying to get someone to click on each individual article. Subscription is just like we want to keep you inside the tent forever. Business coverage, and particularly something like this, which is kind of indie journalism, but like kind of up and coming business, advice on up and coming businesses, can be very important to some people. And I think that this kind of is just like, if you're for instance the Australian subscriber, you'll know what's happening in politics because you work in business and you need to know about policy changes. But also something like this might also help with your personal finances and that other stuff. I think is just an example of like, you know what it's like. It's actually kind of like how the New York Times, if you subscribe to them, you also get a subscription to their cooking app and also their crosswords app. Like that all sounds like ridiculous because, well, not ridiculous, but it all sounds like, well, like who's using all three of those things or who's subscribing for all three of those things. But each individual thing that's totally different just adds another reason why they're kind of invaluable. In a way, I think this purchase is kind of similar to the New York Times's crossword app.
So how important do you think it is, for papers, like the Australian, for example, to continue kind of reinventing themselves, when it comes to kind of moving into the future and trying to keep people in that tent of subscription, moving forward.
Yeah, super important. And I think for them as well, when you're digital, it doesn't really cost you anything more to have more subscribers. Like the actual marginal cost is so small that it means that, like, the more people you get directly paying for it, the more you can kind of offer. And it's this kind of pinwheel of like, oh, you've got more money, so you can use it on more things, and hopefully those additional things that you do bring in more subscribers. For them, you've got more money coming in, they're adding new digital subscribers, and they're like, well, we can bring in this organization, this business, and the indie journalists and what they cover, and hopefully that'll bring more people in. So I think for them, like, I guess there's the literal cost of the staff and the purchase, but it's a pretty like it's a pretty easy thing for them to do, and something that adds to their existing appeal but makes it broader. I wouldn't be surprised if this is actually quite a smart acquisition.
Now, former News Corp and Foxtel chief executive Peter Tonner has been elevated to deputy chair of the ABC. He was a recent appointment, and before that, he was part of the consortium that saved wire service AAP from extinction. Nine Papers' Stephen Brooke and Samantha Hutchinson note this positions him to potentially take over when Aisha Buttros's term finishes in 2024. Now, Cam, what do you think about some people saying it's a News Corp takeover of the ABC? That sounds pretty dramatic.
I'm not really kind of convinced of that. I know there's people out there who fear that any time there's interference or even an interaction by the government with the ABC, they fear, particularly a conservative government, they fear that it's corrupting it, and the introduction of News Corp, which can sometimes be a bit of a boogeyman, I think only made people more alarmed. I mean, this is a guy who's served at one of the top. He's been in the biggest media companies in Australia, and Foxtel's doing very well as well now. I mean, look, you want someone, to be honest, on the ABC board who has media experience. I haven't seen anything that suggests that he's some sleeper agent ready to turn the ABC over to Rupert Murdoch. You never know, but somehow I don't think so. So yeah, I mean, look, it's all kind of palace intrigue. The idea of who will take over when Ida is, if she finishes up and she's not reappointed in 2024, but also. That's a little way off yet. So I'm trying to deal with what I'm doing this week, not what's happening in 2024.
Yeah, look, I think I agree with you on this particular point. You've got your shock jocks, your News Corp shock jocks, or your Sky News shock jocks. You've got, whenever you think of, the Daily Telegraph, you do think of, Andrew Bolt, or, when you think of Sky News, you think of, Chris Kenny, or you think of Peter Credlin. So you do have your right-wing conservatives that you automatically link with a particular broadcaster or with a particular News Corp paper. But for the most part, I think a lot of us journos and a lot of us media execs, we're just I think we could easily work for News Corp, or we could easily work for the ABC. I think at the end of the day, a lot of people, are impartial, and they take their jobs, quite seriously and professionally. So I don't think this is anything that we need to worry about at all.
Yeah, totally.
Okay, so we have some good news. News Corp has announced a $1 million donation to rural and remote mental health. Media Week reports that the money will be used to deliver mental health literacy and suicide prevention training for bushfire-impacted communities over 2 years, commencing early next year. Beginning in 2022, the project will work with mental health professionals, community leaders, organisations and locals to identify areas of need and design solutions in communities that they identify as most at need. Now, Cam, what are your thoughts on this?
Oh, look, hard to hate on this at all. I mean, this is kind of a good thing. I don't know, like, it's supposed to be a wet summer, isn't it? But I've just been fearing what would happen if, combining COVID with bushfires, people having to leave their homes, go in the same places with a pandemic. I know that things are better at the moment, but the thought of that kind of terrifies me. Anything to help out the communities who've been affected by it. But look, fingers crossed that this is a safe summer. We don't have any more. We've had enough emergencies, I think, recently.
That's right, and there have definitely been a lot of communities who have been impacted by both. Obviously the bushfires went into 2020, and that was when COVID hit. So, and I think a lot of communities, they're feeling refreshed. They've rebuilt. They're looking forward to having people visit from metropolitan cities, and suddenly we had this massive lockdown in Sydney, and no one could actually leave to support these communities. So I agree. I think it's a good thing that News Corp has stepped up to focus on mental health, particularly for bushfire impacted communities. And there's nothing really bad that you can say about this.
Yeah.
So
yeah, good on them.
yeah.
And now on to Good News Corp, Bad News Corp of the Week, the segment where we reflect on the wins and poke a bit of fun at the some of the less savory parts of it. Now, my Good News Corp of the Week, Nat, is something, it's a little bit tongue-in-cheek, but I quite enjoyed it. It's an article about Education Minister Alan Tudge and his comments saying that shutting down debate and other recent trends on university campuses would have left former Prime Minister Robert Menzies aghast. The reason why I quite enjoyed this is that in the physical copy of the paper, the headline was something like "Menzies aghast at trends on university campuses," which was hilarious because I'm like, hasn't he been dead for like 30 years?
It's like, how can he respond to something like this?
I was like, oh, good, like incredible work to be able to report on what Robert Menzies thinks about cancel culture.
Headline of the year.
So that was, I quite enjoyed that. And my bad news corp of the week. This was from Sky News, from a frequent guest on this segment, Andrew Bolt. He said that Rudd and Turnbull are being destroyed by their News Corp obsession. Former Prime Ministers Kevin Rudd and Malcolm Turnbull are being destroyed by their obsession with News Corp. They're absolutely manic to destroy the people they blame from their fall from office. Now, what do you think? Would you? I mean, look, we've seen Kevin Rudd and Malcolm Turnbull talk a lot about News Corp, but I also think that there's this obsession kind of goes both ways.
Look, I don't think Andrew Bolt should be talking about obsessions, but in saying that, I do think there has been, it does seem like there is a concerted effort by Rudd and Turnbull to to go out of their way to talk badly about News Corp and anything that it does. But look, I do think it goes both ways. Obviously it's just ironic that Andrew Bolt is talking about Rudd and Turnbull embarking on this campaign against News Corp when he does that pretty much every week.
Yeah, look, I think both sides kind of enjoy it. I think, that they're both getting what they want out of each other, which is something to talk about, something to rile their kind of supporters up. And so maybe, this obsession is good for both of them.
I think it seems that way, and but I think it is definitely a bad News Corp story, and I think that kind of it serves as a bit of a distraction. I think from the important issues at play. I think obviously criticism of News Corp and of any media is obviously very, very important, and I think that's obviously the purpose of this particular podcast to provide critique. But I think you can fall into the trap of going too far, and I think sometimes that can kind of take space away in the media cycle of more important issues at play. Well, thank you for listening. If you aren't already subscribed, you can find us on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, or just about everywhere. Or join our podcast group on Facebook at Murdochracy Podcast.
Thank you to Kevin MacLeod for the theme music, the ABC for the recordings from the archive that we use in the theme, Ruby Innes for our artwork. Thank you to you, Natalie Sekulovska. Good to have you on the mic at last.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. It was great fun.
And get well soon, Sammy. See you now.
All right. See you next time.